Please be seated. I just looked up and found Elf on a Shelf on this pillar here facing me. Do you remember the story, the creation story in Genesis? It's an old favorite. We hear it quite a bit. It's the story where God creates the world and all that inhabit in it in 6 days. God speaks, and God's words are powerful. Let there be light, and there's light, and it's good. Sun, moon, and stars, let there be sea and land, and they are good. Let there be life, birds, crawling things, animals, and they are also good. Finally, God speaks, and human beings are created, male and female, in the image of God. And God says, "This is incredibly good." When God speaks, it's not just talk, there is action. It's that way throughout Scripture. God spoke to Abraham and Sarah, and a people were gathered and sent to be a blessing. God spoke to Moses, and enslaved people found freedom. God spoke through the prophets. Thunder rolled in judgment, and comfort was whispered. But for all the words that God spoke, one word was reserved. God kept back one very personal word. Any guesses? Yes. Yes. A word so powerful it could only be communicated in the most personal way. So how did God say yes to God's creation? John's Gospel tells us that the Word was made flesh, and we beheld his glory. Jesus is God's yes to a broken and beautiful world. He who was present at the creation of heaven and earth was born to Mary and Joseph in a dirt-poor place to proclaim God's abiding yes. No matter where you find yourself, that yes is present. You might see on your screen 2 photos. One is a mother and child. The other is a grandmother and child. The first would be familiar. It could be from here. It's not, but it could be. The second is a grandmother in South Africa. When her daughter died of AIDS, she took in the children, including the youngest baby. I've seen parents in all kinds of circumstances place a kiss on the forehead of their newborn or their very young child. In fact, those of you who are parents, probably when you can get away with it, plant a kiss on the children who are any age. That's what God does with Jesus. God plants a kiss on the crown of humanity. It's the essential work of parenting, isn't it? And I would add that it's the hardest work of pastoring because it's so hard to grasp. Yes, you are beloved. No one and nothing can strip you of that essential identity. You are God's beloved child, as is each person you will ever meet. That's the incarnation in a nutshell. Yes, you are beloved. I'm tempted to quit while I might be ahead, but you know there's a catch. If our lives are to be transformed, the yes must be mutual. Augustine, the great bishop, African bishop of Hippo, said it this way. He said, "Without God, we cannot Without us, God will not. So it's simple, right? Just say yes. Maybe not quite. In 10 days, I'll be preaching at the funeral for the Right Reverend Richard Grine, a former bishop of New York. Some of you might have known him. This Advent, I've been missing something which arrived in my mail every December for the longest time until just a few years ago when his dementia kept him from writing them. On the outside of the card was always a lovely piece of art, a Botticelli or something else. On the inside, it was left blank except for what he would scrawl, and his handwriting was a scrawl on the inside. Janet, open your heart to the incarnate Word. Sometimes it simply said, Janet, let your heart be the creche where Jesus lives. It caught me up short every year. It was like he knew something about me that I didn't easily convey to the world, that my heart is not always open. Maybe you've experienced that as well. Is my heart the creche where Jesus lives? Is your heart the creche where Jesus lives? We must all ask ourselves this question. I love that this year our creche is under the altar, right there. It's so very Eucharistic. Tonight, at the conclusion of the Eucharistic prayer, and just after the Lord's Prayer, as the bread is broken and the wine is poured, we will sing the French carol, Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence. Let all mortal flesh keep silence, and with fear and trembling stand. Ponder nothing earthly minded, for with blessing in his hand, Christ our God to earth descendeth. Actually, in the hymn, that 3-syllable word takes on 6 syllables. Our full homage to demand. We sing that as the action of God comes to roost in the bread and the wine and in all of us. Sometimes we think that the only thing being consecrated at the altar is the bread and the wine, but that's just not true. Within that Eucharistic prayer, which is prayed over those elements, as we call them, is also prayed over each and every one of us. We are becoming the Christ. We're invited again and again to open ourselves to the divine kiss so that we might be the creche of God's love in the world. There may be another catch. One year, I spent a chilly sabbatical in South Africa. Now you see a photo of a resident of South Africa. A chilly sabbatical because it was their winter, our summer here. And mostly I was working with members of the Order of the Holy Cross, who have a monastery there, but also I was with 2 missionary friends 3 hours out in the eastern Transkei, the poorest of poorest areas where 80% of the population was without work and where people were dying of AIDS by the score every day. It was a transformative experience. It was also pretty rough. So at the end, I decided that I would treat myself to 3 days at a game reserve so that I could see up close the great animals of southern Africa. Upon arrival, I was led to a beautiful plush and heated chalet. Let me tell you, this was the first time I experienced heat in the 2 months I was there, with a deck and pool overlooking the beautiful veld. So I opened the door and stepped out onto the deck. I had it all to myself, or so I thought, until I heard a commotion. A commotion first of hooves. A group of reebok, beautiful deer-like creatures, went speeding by. They're fast. So, well, that's nice. Let me grab my camera and take a picture. And then, shortly after, a different kind of rumble came by. It was a group of warthogs, Pumbas, if you know the Lion King. They were slower, but they seemed to be moving their little legs as fast as they could. And finally, I could see what the fuss was all about. A group of lions, no more than, lions, no more than 50 feet from me, went running by, hoping that they might catch up at least with the warthogs. As you might imagine, I put my camera down, backed up ever so slowly, and went back into the chalet. And at that point, there was a knock on my door, and the same person who had guided me to the chalet knocked. I opened the door, and he said, "Ma'am, there are lions out there." No kidding. And so I'll escort you back to the lodge when you're ready for your next game ride. So I went on the ride. It was an evening ride. The sky was just magnificent with the stars of the southern hemisphere, including the Southern Cross, which I could never, ever quite make out, and it's on the screen now. The bar is just there to help you identify it, or the bars. After dinner, the young Xhosa guide, Xhosa being the tribe of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, his rifle in hand, was waiting to walk me back to my room. The magnificent African sky was overhead, and I paused to ask him to point out the Southern Cross, the constellation that I still wasn't sure I had actually seen or identified. He gave a quick wave, there it is right there, and motioned me to keep walking and said, "Ma'am, there are lions out there." We went a little further, and I started to tell him stories about the Northern Hemisphere's North Star and how it guided many enslaved persons to freedom. He slowed down a little for that and told me, "We have many stories about the Southern Cross and our other stars." And he began to tell me some of the stories, and while he did, he lowered his rifle. I could hear the crunch of the gravel, but he kept one hand on it. And with the other hand, he was pointing again. But then he caught himself. "Ma'am, there are lions out there." We continued to the door of my chalet, and I heard the sound of the gun hitting the gravel altogether. He had dropped it. He laid down his weapon and raised up both of his hands, and I followed suit with both of my hands. Both of my arms were upraised, and he told me that his ancestors and the ancestors of all were above and were blessing us. Those were the stars. Yes, there were lions out there, but we were sharing a moment of communion. At least for that moment, we weren't afraid of the lions. By the time we've reached 5 or 6 years old, we realize that there are lions in the world, right? Only the lions we see, the lions we encounter, are in the forms of institutions or people, situations that can and do hurt us, sometimes badly. And we all find our weapons of choice. They may be sharp words. They may be a cold countenance. Our weapon may be refusing joy and refusing generosity for ourselves and for others. You name your weapons. We all have them. But then we find ourselves under an African sky or a Bethlehem sky, under God's great creation, or even just walking across the street here in Rye. And we intuitively sense God's yes to us and to this world. And we receive that kiss on the head. And sometimes for just a moment, we know in our deepest selves that we are loved. In those moments, the urge overcomes us to say yes. We want to, and we also know quite instinctively that to say yes is to put down our rifle or our weapon of choice, to allow our own vulnerability to show. And it's in those moments when we hear the invitation spoken tonight. Open your heart to the creche that is the incarnation, the real human manifestation of God's love. No matter what, open your heart. There is certainly a lot to be afraid of in this world and a lot to worry about. But still, at the beginning of the Eucharist prayer this evening, the presider will ask, "Lift up your hearts," and we will answer, "We lift them to the Lord." Make sure you say it, and with gusto. It's in the bulletin. Pay attention with your response. Lift up your heart and say yes to the love that is poured on you this night and every night. Eat the bread, swallow the wine, be one with Christ and with each other. And then go out to be God's love in the world. Even lions kiss their children. Amen.